She came to Oregon in the last week of October with one carpetbag, $9.20, and a husband she had never seen. The man waiting at the coach stop did not take off his hat. The boy beside him did not speak, then or for a long while after. The town of Coldwater Bend watched from the porch of the feed store the way people watch weather coming, curious and unhurried and already certain how it would end. Verity Sloan had answered an advertisement, not a courtship. She had been a hospital nurse in Sacramento until she told a doctor he was wrong about a child's fever, and she had been right, and it had cost her the position anyway. What nobody wrote in the letter was that the orchard was one bad harvest from the bank, that the man who milled and bought every apple in the county had been shorting them for 11 years, and that the boy had not said a word aloud since the winter his mother died. The town gave her until Christmas. She intended to be there in the spring, and the spring after that. If you have ever had to build something out of nothing, press like and tell me what town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The stagecoach came down out of the hills at 4 in the afternoon, and the light was already going. Verity sat with her bag on her knees and watched the country change from fur to open ground. Orchard rows laid out like stitching, the trees stripped and gray, the grass gone yellow between them. Somewhere in the last mile it began to rain, not hard, just the fine steady rain of that valley in autumn, the kind that soaks a person slowly enough that they do not think to move out of it. She had read the letter so many times the creases had worn to lint. Widower, 1 child, acres and apples, 12 stands of bees. Seeks a woman of steady habits and plain sense, no romantic expectations, terms honest. She had liked the last 2 words better than anything else in it. She had answered it on hospital stationery she had no right to anymore. The coach stopped in front of a building that was a post office on one side and a saloon on the other. Verity climbed down and stood in the mud and looked at the men on the feed store porch until they looked somewhere else. He was easy to find. He was standing apart, near the hitching rail, a tall man gone lean the way men go lean when they work more than they eat, in an oilcloth coat that had been mended at both elbows by somebody who did not much care how it looked. He was watching the far end of the street, where the orchard hills started, as though he had left something up there and was thinking about going back for it. When he turned, she saw that he was younger than she had assumed and older around the eyes than his years accounted for. "Miss Sloan, Mr. Rennick Amos," he said, and did not offer his hand, and did not explain why not until she insisted 3 days later that the left one did not open all the way. The boy stood at his hip, 9 years old, maybe 10, dark hair combed flat with water, a coat buttoned to the throat and too thin for the season. He held a slate against his chest with both arms the way another child would hold a cat. He looked at her boots and then at her hands, and then, briefly, at her face, and there was nothing rude in it and nothing welcoming either. It was the look of a boy taking inventory. "This is Ansel," Amos said. Verity crouched down, which put her at the height of the slate. "Ansel, I'm glad to meet you." The boy considered her a moment. Then he shifted the slate, took the chalk stub from his coat pocket, and wrote and turned it around. "You have a bag. I do." The others had trunks. She read it twice. Behind her, Amos made a small sound in his throat that could have been a cough. "Then I expect I'll be easier to move if it comes to that," Verity said. And she stood up, and she carried her own bag to the wagon before either of them could reach for it. They rode out of town in the rain. The mule was named Gospel, Amos said when she asked, and offered no reason. The road climbed a low grade and turned along a creek, and then the orchard opened out on the left. Row on row of old trees going up the slope, and past them, on a flat bench above the creek, 12 white boxes standing in the wet grass with their lids weighted down by rocks. "Bees," Verity said. 8, Amos said. 12 boxes. 8 with anything in them. Might be 7 by spring. The house was small and square and honest. A porch that sagged on the north side. A kitchen with a good stove and no curtains. A parlor nobody had sat in for some time, judging by the way the air moved when the door opened. Off the kitchen there was a room with a bed, a chair, a washstand, and a hook on the back of the door. "Papa says you can change whatever you want," Ansel wrote. "I'd rather learn what's here first," Verity said. "Changing things before you understand them is how people break them." The boy studied that. Then he wiped the slate with his sleeve and wrote again. "Mrs. Price moved the stovepipe the second week. The kitchen smoked all winter." "Who is Mrs. Price?" "The one before you. She stayed 9 weeks. Verity set her bag on the bed. "And before Mrs. Price, Miss Deakins. 5 weeks. And a woman from Salem whose name I don't remember. 3 days. He held the slate up steady, no cruelty in it at all, only the terrible neutrality of a child reporting facts. You're the fourth. Well, Verity said, I haven't got anywhere better to be, so I'd say I'll beat 9 weeks. Something moved across the boy's face and was gone before she could name it. He wiped the slate and left the room. The dog came out from under the porch at dusk. An old brindle bitch, gray in the muzzle, eyes clouded to blue-white and useless. She came straight to Verity without hesitating, put her head against Verity's knee, and stood there breathing. That's Pennyroyal, Amos said from the doorway. She's blind. She knows the whole place by the fence lines. Don't move the water bucket. I won't. People do. I won't, Verity said again, and he looked at her for the first time that day, directly, 1 full second, and then went to see to the mule. She was married 3 days later in the front room of a justice of the peace, in a dress she had made over, with the boy as one witness and the justice's wife as the other. It took 11 minutes. Amos said his part in a voice that carried no farther than the table. Afterward, out on the walk, he said, I want to be plain with you. I don't have anything left over to give a person. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it so you know what the terms are. I read the terms, Verity said. I'm not here for what's left over. I'm here for what's there. He looked at the street for a while. The orchard's in poor shape. Most things worth having are, when you get to them. They rode home. It rained. She cooked supper in a strange kitchen and found the flour weevilled and threw it out and made cornbread instead. And the boy ate 2 pieces and wrote thank you on the slate and set it face down on the table like a card he did not want anyone to see. November went cold and clear. Verity learned the place the way she had learned wards, by walking it at the same hour every day until the ordinary was ordinary and the wrong thing stood out. She learned that the orchard was 3 kinds of trees. Up the slope, old Gravensteins that Amos's father had put in, thick-trunked, half of them with limbs gone to canker. In the middle, a block of Baldwins for eating and keeping, and along the creek, the ones that mattered. 41 trees of a russet cider apple, whose name Amos said as if he were saying a dead man's, tannic and hard, and no good on a table, the kind of apple that makes a cider you remember. She learned to tell them by the bark before the leaves came, and she learned that no one in the county but Amos still grew them, because no one in the county but Amos was fool enough to keep something that only had one buyer. She learned the bees. She had never kept bees. She said so, plainly, the first morning she followed him up to the bench above the creek. He did not laugh at her, which she filed away. He handed her a veil that had belonged to his wife and showed her how to tuck it into the collar, and he lit the smoker with punk wood and pine needles. And he said, you go slow. If you go slow, they don't mind you much. He was different at the hives. She saw it right away. Wherever else he went, he carried himself like a man expecting to be asked to leave. At the hives he was patient and unhurried and something close to gentle, and his bad hand, which he kept in his pocket in town, came out and worked the hive tool, stiff at the last 2 fingers, precise anyway. Hattie kept the bees, he said once, and did not say anything else. The boy named them. Verity learned this by accident, coming up the bench in the 2nd week and finding Ansel sitting cross-legged in the frost-killed grass with the slate on his knees, chalk marks beside each box. Dorcas. Bishop. The quiet one. Little sister, Gospel 2. You've named the hives. He nodded.
Which one is Dorcas?
He pointed to the 4th box, the biggest, 3 supers high. Why Dorcas, he thought. He wrote. Because she works and doesn't complain. Verity sat down in the wet grass next to him and put her hands in her lap and watched the entrance of the 4th hive, where in the cold noon a few bees came and went on business she did not yet understand. After a while she said, which one is worrying you? The boy pointed to the last box. The small one at the end of the row, set a little apart. He wrote for a long time, little sister. Papa says she's queenless. He says by February she'll be dead. He says every year one dies, and you can't help it. Is that true? Ansel looked at her. He wiped the slate slowly with his sleeve and did not write anything at all, and Verity understood that she had just been asked a question in return. She wrote to a man in Portland that night. She had found his name in a 2-year-old copy of a beekeeping journal in the parlor. A cooperative buyer named Hollis Beaudry, who dealt in comb and extract honey and paid by moisture content and floral source. She asked him 3 questions about uniting a weak colony to a strong one in cold weather. She used her own money for the stamp. He wrote back in 9 days. Newspaper, he said. Lay a sheet of newspaper between the 2 colonies and let them chew through it slowly, and by the time they meet, they smell like each other and they don't fight. She read that letter 4 times. It struck her as the truest thing anyone had told her in a year. They did it on a still afternoon in the first week of December, the temperature just above freezing, working fast with cold hands. She held the frames. Amos made the cut. Ansel stood back with the smoker and did not once let it go out. They set little sister's brood box on top of Dorcas, with a sheet of the Coldwater Bend Sentinel between them, and they weighted the lid with a rock, and they walked down the bench in the failing light, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say for 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, Verity went up alone in the frost, in the dark before breakfast, and knelt with her ear against the side of the hive, and heard the one steady hum where there had been 2. She was still kneeling there when Amos came up the bench with a lantern. "Well, 1 sound," she said. He set the lantern down. He crouched and put his own ear to the wood, and stayed there so long that Verity looked away, out at the orchard rows going pale with morning, and gave the man his privacy. The boy went to school. This was the thing about the winter that Verity did not expect to matter, and that turned out to matter most. The school was 1 room at the north end of Coldwater Bend with a stove in the middle, and a woman named Mrs. Tarbell at the front, and Ansel walked the 1.25 miles to it 4 days a week, and did not say 1 word in it, ever. And Mrs. Tarbell let him write his answers on the slate and marked them right when they were right. "He is the best speller I have." Mrs. Tarbell told Verity in January, on a Thursday when Verity had come to town for coffee and salt. "He does his sums faster than the 12-year-olds. He reads anything you put in front of him. And the other children—" Mrs. Tarbell folded her hands. "Some of them are unkind. Ollie Frame calls him the dummy. I have spoken to Ollie's father twice, and I would not call the conversation a success." Verity said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, a wagon went by loaded with pomace, the wet brown crush of pressed apples going out to somebody's hogs. "Does Ansel cry?" "No," said Mrs. Tarbell. "That is what I would tell you if you asked me the important thing. He does not cry, and he does not fight, and he does not stop coming. I have taught 22 years, and I have not often seen that in a grown man." That night Verity sat at the kitchen table across from the boy while he worked his arithmetic, and she said, without looking up from the sock she was darning, "Mrs. Tarbell says you spell better than anyone she's got." He shrugged one shoulder. "She also says a boy named Ollie Frame calls you a name." The chalk stopped. Then it moved again, and he turned the slate. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Verity said. "It just isn't true. Those are different things, and it's worth knowing which is which." He looked at the slate. He rubbed out what he'd written and wrote. "Small, at the bottom edge, Mama talked to me the whole time, even when I was asleep. Papa says she used to sing while she cut the wax." Verity kept her needle moving because she did not trust her hands to be still. "Then she died in the snow, going for the doctor," he wrote. "For me, I had the croup." He wiped it out at once, hard, with his palm, and the chalk dust made a gray smear across the front of his shirt. And he sat there with his hands flat on the table. "Ansel," Verity said, "look at me. He did. Nothing about that was your doing. Not one part of it. A boy who has the croup is a boy who has the croup. You are not the weather, and you are not the road." He didn't write anything, but he did not leave the table either, and after a while he picked up the chalk and finished his sums, and Verity finished the sock, and neither of them said anything more, and it was the first evening in that house that felt like an evening rather than a truce. The books were in the desk in the parlor, in the second drawer, under a bundle of seed catalogs. Verity had gone looking for the household figures, because she had been keeping the kitchen on $1.40 a week and wanted to know if she could stretch to a hen. What she found instead was 11 years of an orchard's life, written out in a hand that got smaller and tighter as the years went on. She sat down and read it the way she used to read a chart. Apples sold to D. Kell, Coldwater Bend Cider Works, in barrels. Honey sold to D. Kell, in cans, by the pound. Every fall, every spring, no other buyer, not once, not 1 year. She read the numbers. Then she went out to the barn, where 109 barrels from the fall pressing stood empty and stacked, and she counted them, and she went back inside and read the numbers again. She had the ledger on the kitchen table when Amos came in at dusk. She had waited until Ansel was in bed. She had made coffee because it seemed to her that a person ought to be given coffee before this kind of conversation. "I found the accounts," she said. He looked at the book. He didn't look guilty. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work. "They're in the desk. I know. I was after the flour money. She turned the ledger around. Who is Dorsey Kell? Mills every apple in the county. Buys the honey too. On the side, ships it east. His father built the works. Amos pulled out the chair and sat. He's the only press within 30 miles. You want your apples pressed? You go to Kell. Does he grade your fruit? He grades everything. How? He looks in the barrel. Verity turned the ledger to the page she had marked with a straw. 11 years, she said. Every year, between a fifth and a quarter of your crop is written down as windfall grade. Bruised, culls, hog fruit. 2 cents where sound fruit is 9. She put her finger on the line. This year, 109 barrels, 26 of them called windfall. Some are, how many did you pick off the ground? He opened his mouth, closed it. You picked them all off the tree, Verity said. I watched you do it in October. You picked with your bad hand tucked in your coat, and you set every apple in the barrel like it was an egg, because I saw you, and so did your son. 26 barrels of windfalls came out of an orchard you never let an apple fall in. Amos looked at the ledger for a long time. And the honey, she went on, quieter. He pays you 8 cents a pound and calls it mixed table grade. Mr. Baudry in Portland pays 11 for mixed and 14 for single source, tested. Your bench is above 40 acres of Gravenstein and 41 russets, and nothing else within a mile that blooms in May. That is single-source honey. That is 14 cents. You've been getting 8. The stove ticked. Somewhere out in the dark, Pennyroyal shifted under the porch. I know, Amos said. Verity sat back. Not the numbers, he said. Not like that. I never sat down and put it beside another man's price, because there wasn't another man's price to put it beside. But I've known 10 years that Dorsey Kell was taking something off me, and I let him, because if he won't press my fruit, I've got 40 acres of apples, and a hand that won't close, and no way on God's earth to turn them into money before they rot. He said all of it flatly. He might have been discussing rain. I let a man rob me, because I couldn't afford to catch him at it. You can think whatever you want about that. I think, Verity said, that you have been alone. He didn't answer. There's a difference, she said, between a man who doesn't see a thing and a man who sees it and hasn't got a second pair of hands. I'm the second pair of hands. That was the arrangement. It's in your own letter, Amos, in your own writing. She turned the ledger back around to face him. I'd like your permission to spend the winter proving it. He looked up. Proving it how? Barrel by barrel, Verity said. Apple by apple, if it comes to that. What she did that winter, she did in a barn with a lantern and a borrowed spring scale. And it was not dramatic, and it took 4 months. She weighed. She wrote. She wrote down the weight of a barrel empty and a barrel full, and the tear of the barrel by number. Chalked on the head 1 to 109. She learned to grade fruit the way Mr. Baudry's letters taught her to grade it, and the way the Oregon State Board of Horticulture's bulletin taught her, which she sent for and paid 2 cents postage on. Sound. Slight blemish. Cull. She learned that a russet's rough skin looks like a blemish to a man who wants it to, and looks like a russet to a man who knows apples. She learned honey. She learned to read the cappings, to test moisture by the way a comb weighed against the same comb the week before, to know a spring flow from a summer flow by the color held up to a lamp. She wrote to Portland 11 times, and Hollis Baudry wrote back 11 times. And by March she had a letter in his hand stating in plain words what his cooperative would pay per pound for single-source orchard honey, delivered in Portland, subject to inspection. She did it all after supper, most nights, with the boy sitting on an upturned crate, holding the lantern steady. And somewhere in February, she noticed that Ansel had started doing the arithmetic in his head before she got to it, and was writing the answers on the slate and holding them up, and that he was faster than she was. And in the middle of it, in the last week of February, on a night when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees, little sister's old box, the empty one they had left standing at the end of the row, out of some sentiment nobody would admit to, went over in the wind. Verity went out at 2 in the morning with a lantern to set it up and found Pennyroyal out in the orchard, 100 yards off her known lines, turned around and shivering and lost in a place she had walked blind. For 6 years, she had to carry her back. 60 pounds of old dog, and Verity's arms shaking by the barn, and Amos coming out of the house in his shirt with the lantern held high. They put her by the stove and rubbed her down with sacking, and she slept 18 hours and woke and drank and lived another 2 years, though nobody knew that yet. Amos sat on the floor with his back against the wood box, watching the dog breathe. She's never once gone off the fence line, he said. 6 years. The wind moved the box. She counts by the boxes. He put his hand on the dog's ribs. Hattie found her in a ditch, half drowned. Everybody said drown her the rest of the way. He said it to the dog, not to Verity. She said no, this one's just been unlucky. Verity, in the doorway with the kettle, understood that she had been told something enormous, and that it had been told to a dog, and that this was how it was going to be with him, and that she found she did not mind. The letter she wrote to Dorsey Kell in March was 4 sentences long. It said that the Rennick Orchard would deliver its spring honey to the cooperative in Portland at the cooperative's published price. It said that the fall pressing would go to Coldwater Bend Cider Works as usual, at grade determined by weight and inspection, and that the grading would be done in the presence of both parties. It said the barrels were numbered and the weights recorded. It said she would expect him on the 4th of April. She showed the letter to Amos before she sealed it. He read it twice. He'll come angry, yes. He might not press for us at all. He might not, Verity said. In which case we will haul 40 acres of apples over the grade to Salem, and pay a stranger to press them, and lose money on the freight, and be poorer this year than last. I have run those figures. We can survive it once. We cannot survive 11 more years of 8 cents. Amos folded the letter along her crease. At supper that night, Ansel wrote on the slate and held it up. Ollie Frame says his father sells to Mr. Kell too. He says Mr. Kell is a fair man. Neither adult answered right away. Will he be angry, the boy wrote. Almost certainly, Verity said. Ansel looked at his father. Amos, who had not said one word about it all week, set down his fork. He's not fair, Amos said. Never was. That's a fact and not a temper. Your mother's people would say it plain, so I'm saying it plain at my own table for once. He picked the fork back up. His being angry is his business. It isn't ours. The boy wiped the slate very slowly, and wrote nothing more, and ate his supper, and Verity saw, out of the corner of her eye, that he was sitting straighter. Dorsey Kell came on the 4th of April in a covered buggy with a hired man driving it, and stepped down into the yard in a good coat, and Verity understood immediately what kind of trouble he was. He was not a brute, he was pleasant. He shook Amos's right hand, and asked after the orchard, and said the winter had been hard on everybody, and remarked that the porch was newly braced, and complimented it. He was a man who had built a fortune not on cruelty, but on the steady arithmetic of nobody ever checking, and on the further arithmetic that when at last somebody did check, they could be soothed. Now, he said, in the barn, with his thumbs in his vest, I got your letter, Mrs. Rennick. Then you know how the day will go. I know it's a great deal of trouble for a small orchard. He smiled at Amos. Amos, we've done business 11 years without a scale. 12, Amos said. Kell's smile stayed where it was. Verity set the spring scale on the plank she had laid across 2 barrels, and she set the ledger beside it, and she took the chalk from her apron pocket. Barrel 1, she said. It took 4 hours. She weighed. Amos rolled and steadied. The hired man wrote nothing and watched everything. Ansel sat on the crate and did not hold the lantern, because it was daylight, and so he held nothing at all and simply watched. And once, when Kell said a number aloud, the boy shook his head, one small motion, and Verity said, 94 pounds, 4 ounces, not 91. And Kell looked at the boy for the first time, and then at the scale, and then said, so it is. At barrel 61 he tried the grade. Now, that's cull fruit, he said. Look at the skin on it. That's a russet, Verity said. The skin is what a russet has instead of a shine. Board of Horticulture Bulletin, page 9, if you'd care to read it. Sound flesh, sound stem, no bruise. 9 cents. There's gradation in every barrel. There is. That's why I graded them one at a time. She turned the ledger toward him. 88 barrels sound. 14 slight blemish. And I'll take the reduced price on those without argument, because they are what I say they are. 7 cull. Not 26. Kell looked at the page. Then he looked at Amos with an expression Verity had seen on the faces of men who had just realized that the quiet one had married someone. And if I say the price is 6, then you'll say it to a woman who has a letter in her apron from Hollis Baudry of Portland, who buys russet cider stock at 8.5 and pays the freight from Salem. Verity did not raise her voice. She had learned in hospitals that the quiet register is the one that carries. You'd still be the better deal at 7.25, Mr. Kell, and I'd rather take the better deal, because Amos's father planted those trees and yours built that press, and it would be a shame for both of us to be stubborn. But I've done the freight sums. I've done them 3 times. I can afford to be wrong once. Can you afford to lose 40 acres of the only cider apple in this county? The barn was very quiet. The hired man was looking at the roof. 7.25, Dorsey Kell said, on the sound fruit. And 11 cents on the honey, if I ever see any of it again, which I doubt. You won't, Verity said. The honey goes to Portland, but you'll press our apples for the next 20 years, and you'll press them by weight, and the ledger will be open on the plank every time you come. He paid in cash out of a leather case, counting it onto the barrel head, and he put on his hat, and at the door of the barn he stopped and said to Amos, not to her, "Your first wife never asked me a question in her life." "No," Amos said. "She trusted people. It's the only thing about her I ever wanted to fix." The buggy went down the lane. Verity stood in the barn door and felt her hands begin, at last, to shake, and put them in her apron so that nobody would see. When she turned around, Ansel was standing behind her holding the slate up over his head with both arms, and it said 94 pounds 40 unks. She would remember later that this was the moment she started to believe she was going to stay, and that it had nothing to do with the money. May came, and the orchard bloomed, and the bench above the creek roared. Verity had not known that a stand of bees in a bloom makes a sound you can hear from 30 yards, a sound like a kettle just before it boils, and she stood among the hives in the white noise of it with Hattie's veil over her face, and understood why a woman would sing while she cut the wax. They took the spring honey in June. 212 pounds, single source, water white, and Verity crated it, and Amos hauled it to the depot. And Hollis Beaudry's cooperative wrote a draft for $31.08, which was more money at one time than the orchard had seen since the year before the mother died. And then, in the second week of July, on a Tuesday, a boy from the frame place came riding up the lane to say his father was spraying the pears with Paris green and had been all week, and that the wind had been out of the south, and that his mother said Mrs. Rennick would want to know. Verity walked up to the bench. She stood there for a long time. The frame orchard began 400 yards south, over the creek. The wind was out of the south. It had been out of the south, off and on, for 9 days. She lifted the lid on Bishop and found what she was afraid of, a scatter of dead bees on the bottom board, a few dozen, not a collapse, not a disaster, just enough. The summer flow was in the supers, 8 boxes of it, 90-odd pounds, already capped, worth 14 cents to Portland, because Portland tested nothing but water content and floral source, and took a producer's word for the rest. She sat down in the grass. Amos found her there an hour later. "Frame's boy came," he said. "Yes, bad? Not bad," Verity said. "That's the trouble. If it were bad, I'd know what to do," she told him. She told him that arsenic in honey was a thing nobody had a test for, not yet, that the bulletins argued about it, that the bees that carried it home mostly died before they got there, that in all likelihood the honey in those supers was as clean as anything in the state. "Probably. Almost certainly. And if you're wrong," Amos said. "If I'm wrong, it goes to Portland with our name on the crate, and it goes out to somebody's table, and a child eats it." Verity looked at the hives. "I was a nurse for 9 years, Amos. I have seen what a little arsenic does to a small body over a long time. It does not look like poison. It looks like a child who never quite thrives." Amos crouched down beside her. His bad hand rested on his knee, the 2 stiff fingers curled. "How much is it?" he said. 94 pounds, $13 and change. And it's the middle of July, and we've got the property tax in September, and the new press fee, and the boy has outgrown his boots." Neither of them said anything. "I could write Baudry," Verity said slowly, "and tell him nothing, and he would pay us, and we would be fine. And I would very likely never learn that I had done any harm. That is the part I keep turning over. Not the money, the fact that I would probably never know." Amos picked a stem of grass and turned it in his fingers. "Hattie died going for a doctor for the croup," he said. 9 miles in the snow, the doctor came, the boy lived." He looked out at the trees. "I have spent 6 years asking what it bought, and I think what it bought is a house where nobody lies about what's in the food." Verity looked at him. "Dump it," he said. "Write the man and tell him why." They rendered the 94 pounds down and buried the syrup deep in the pasture where nothing would find it, and Verity wrote to Hollis Beaudry and told him exactly what had happened, the spraying, the wind, the dead bees on the bottom board of a hive named Bishop, and that she could not swear the honey was clean and would not sell what she could not swear to. She was ill about it for a week. $13 was a hen and a winter coat and a pair of boots. She did the figures at the kitchen table at midnight and did them again. Hollis Beaudry's answer came at the end of August. It was 1 page. He wrote that in 19 years no producer had ever written him such a letter. He wrote that the cooperative was starting a graded line under a producer's name and guarantee, and that he would pay 18 cents a pound for it, and that he wanted the Rennick orchard to be the first, and that he had told this to 4 other buyers and to the state board, and that she should expect some correspondence. The correspondence came. By the following spring, there were 7 letters on the parlor desk from beekeepers in 3 counties, asking how she kept her records. And by the spring after that, Verity Sloan Rennick was writing a column, 4 paragraphs at a time, for a farm paper in Salem, at 50 cents the column, about weighing things and writing them down. But that was later. In September, in the thick of it, with the tax paid and $11 left in the tin, she was in the barn trying to free the seized screw on the old cider press they had bought at auction for $4 and the promise of a Sunday's labor, and she had been at it 2 hours, and her knuckles were bleeding. Amos came around the corner of the barn and stood in the door and looked at the press and looked at her. "Do you want help with that?" "I've nearly got it," Verity said, more sharply than she meant. "All right," he said, and went away. He came back 20 minutes later with a length of iron pipe and a wrench she had never seen before, the right one, and he set them on the plank and went out again without a word. She used them. The screw came free in 10 seconds. That evening, on the porch, she said, "Thank you for the wrench. I've been beat by that screw for 4 years," Amos said. And that was as near as either of them came that night to saying what had actually happened. In October, a year to the week from the coach stop, he came up from the barn while she was carrying in the last of the squash and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I've got something," he said. It was a knife, a wax knife, the blade thinned by 20 years of honing, the wooden handle dark with oil, and scratched into the handle with a nail, in a girl's uneven letters, HR. "She cut the cappings with it," Amos said. "It's been in the drawer since. I couldn't look at it and I couldn't throw it out, and I've been walking around a drawer for 6 years. He held it out on his open palm. "It ought to be used. I'd rather it was used by somebody who'll take care of it." Verity took it. Their hands touched, the good one, the calloused edge of his thumb against her fingers, 3 seconds, 4, and neither of them moved, and the squash was heavy on her hip, and the light was going gold across the orchard, and Pennyroyal was thumping her tail on the boards. "I'll take care of it," Verity said. "I know," he said. "That's the whole reason." He did not kiss her. She did not expect him to. They stood there, on the steps in the October light of a place that had been failing and was not failing anymore. And something passed between them that neither of them was going to say out loud that year, and both of them knew it, and neither of them required more than that. The boy spoke on a Sunday in November. They were on the bench above the creek, wrapping the hives in tar paper against the cold, and Verity was on her knees at the 4th box with Hattie's knife in her apron, and she said mostly to herself, "Dorcas is heavy. She'll come through." And Ansel, standing behind her with the twine, said, "Stay." Verity did not turn around. She kept her hands on the tar paper exactly where they were. "What's that?" "Stay," the boy said. His voice was rusted and too high, and it broke in the middle of the one word. The other ones didn't. "Stay." Amos was 30 feet down the row with an armload of rock. He had stopped. He was standing perfectly still with the rocks against his chest and his mouth open, and Verity could see, without looking at him directly, that his face had come apart. She finished tucking the paper under the rim. She stood up and turned around and put her hands on the boy's shoulders, and he was rigid, and then he wasn't. "Ansel," she said, "I'm staying." He cried then, the way a child cries who has been holding a thing up over his head for 6 years and has finally been allowed to set it down. And Amos came up the row and put his arms around both of them, the bad hand and the good, and the hives hummed on into the cold like a kettle that never quite boils, and down in the orchard the frost took the last of the grass and did no harm at all to anything that mattered. The winter after that they put 12 more stands on the bench. The winter after that 30. Ansel read aloud in Mrs. Tarbell's school in the spring, standing up, stumbling, finishing, and Ollie Frame did not say anything because there was nothing left to say. People in the county came to ask Verity how she kept her books. She told them, a scale, a chalk, a number on every barrel, and the nerve to write down what is actually in it. They asked her, sometimes, whether she had married for love. She thought about the answer for years before she settled on it. And by then she was an old woman, and Amos was in the ground, and the orchard belonged to a man who had once been a silent boy. and the hives on the bench above the creek numbered 91. Love, she would say, is a word people use about the beginning. She had not had a beginning worth the word. She had had $9.20 and a coach seat and a letter with the word honest in it. What she had had instead was this: a man who brought her the right wrench and never once said he had told her so. A boy who learned to weigh things because he watched her weigh things. A dog who counted by the boxes. 11 years of theft, undone by nothing more magical than a spring scale and 4 months of nights. 94 pounds 4 ounces. A ruined summer's honey buried in a pasture because no child was going to eat it. Passion, she would say, is a fine thing, and it burns down to nothing the way pine burns down to nothing. Respect is oak. She had not known, standing in the mud outside a post office in October with her bag in her hand and a whole town waiting for her to fail, that she was the kind of woman who stays. Nobody knows that about themselves in advance. You find it out in February, at 2 in the morning, carrying a blind dog through an orchard you did not plant, toward a house that is not yet yours, because she is lost and you are the only one awake. That is all it ever is. You look at what is actually there. You decide it is worth the trouble. You get up the next morning and you do it again. The hives hum, the trees hold. The boy grows up and says the word.